512 megabytes RAM. This was the sweet spot for budget computers between 2004 and 2007. Half a gigabyte sounds tiny now, but at the time, it was enough to run Windows XP comfortably, and even early versions of Windows Vista, though Vista with 512 megabytes was a painful experience. With 512 megabytes, you could browse the web with a few tabs open, listen to music in Winamp, chat on MSN Messenger, and play games from that era at low settings. Watching DVDs and standard definition videos worked fine. The problem started when websites became heavier and tabs began eating more memory. Once Facebook, YouTube HD, and modern web apps appeared, 512 megabytes just couldn't keep up anymore. Today, 512 megabytes is still common inside cheap Android TV boxes, low-end smartphones from emerging markets, smart speakers, and small Linux server setups. Lightweight Linux distros like Puppy Linux or Anti-X can run on 512 megabytes without too much trouble. But for any normal desktop, laptop, or even modern smartphone, 512 megabytes is not enough. You won't be able to open more than one Chrome tab without the system freezing. So 512 megabytes is best left for tiny dedicated devices, not general use computers. 1 gigabyte RAM. 1 gigabyte was the standard amount for laptops and PCs from around 2007 to 2010. This was the Windows Vista and early Windows 7 era. With 1 gigabyte, you could finally run a modern operating system without it feeling completely broken. Vista technically required this much just to function. Windows 7 ran more smoothly on 1 gigabyte and was actually usable for everyday tasks. You could browse the web with maybe 3 or 4 tabs open, use Microsoft Office, watch YouTube at standard quality, and play older games. Multitasking was still limited though. Open Chrome, Word, and a music player at the same time, and you'd already start hitting the limit. Today, 1 gigabyte is the absolute floor for any usable device. It's the standard amount of RAM in cheap Android smartphones from emerging markets, basic Chromebooks, entry-level smart TVs, and tablets meant for kids. Linux runs okay on 1 gigabyte if you stick to lightweight desktops like XFCE or LXQT. But honestly, 1 gigabyte on Windows 10 or 11 is a frustrating experience. The system spends more time managing memory than doing actual work. For modern computing, 1 gigabyte is the bare minimum, and even then, only for very basic single-task use. 2 gigabytes RAM. This was the first amount of RAM that felt genuinely comfortable for normal computer use. With 2 gigabytes, you could run Windows 7 or Windows 8 smoothly, keep 5 or 6 browser tabs open, watch HD videos on YouTube, and even play some lighter games. Microsoft Office, Skype, and basic photo editing in Paint or simple apps all worked fine. The problems start with modern software. Windows 10 and 11 technically run on 2 gigabytes, but the experience is painful. Just booting up and opening one Chrome window can use most of it. Modern Chrome tabs alone can each consume 300 to 500 megabytes. Today, 2 gigabytes is common in budget Android phones, entry-level Chromebooks, basic tablets, and older laptops that haven't been upgraded. It's also enough for a small home server running things like Pi-hole or a simple file share. Lightweight Linux runs great on 2 gigabytes. But for daily Windows use, in 2026, 2 gigabytes is below the practical minimum. You'll be staring at loading bars more often than actually working. 2 gigabytes is fine for single-task light devices, but not for real productivity. 4 gigabytes RAM. For many years, this was considered the minimum for a normal Windows PC. With 4 gigabytes, you could run Windows 10 reasonably well, open 10 or so browser tabs, work in Office, edit photos in basic software, and play older or lighter games at low settings. It handled multitasking decently as long as you didn't push too hard. Today, 4 gigabytes is the bare minimum for modern computing. Windows 11 officially requires 4 gigabytes to install, and even then, the experience feels tight. Chrome with 20 tabs alone can eat most of your RAM. Heavy apps like Photoshop, video editors, or modern games will struggle. 4 gigabytes still shows up in entry-level laptops, budget Chromebooks, mid-range Android phones, and many tablets. It's perfectly fine for students doing light work, kids' computers, and basic office tasks like writing documents, sending emails, and watching videos. Linux runs beautifully on 4 gigabytes, even with full desktop environments like KDE or GNOME. But if you plan to play modern games, edit videos, or do any creative work, 4 gigabytes will hold you back. For very basic users today, 4 gigabytes is the absolute floor. For anyone doing real work, it's not enough anymore. 8 gigabytes RAM. With 8 gigabytes, you can comfortably run Windows 11, keep 20 or more browser tabs open, use Microsoft Office, stream videos, and play most modern games at medium settings without major issues. Light photo editing in Lightroom and basic video editing in DaVinci Resolve also work fine. This is the size that finally lets you stop worrying about closing tabs or apps just to free up memory. 8 gigabytes is the most common amount in mainstream laptops, gaming PCs, and modern Apple MacBooks. Apple actually claims their 8 gigabytes of unified memory performs more like 16 gigabytes on Windows machines because of how macOS manages memory differently. That claim is debated, but the experience on Mac with 8 gigabytes is genuinely smoother than on Windows with the same amount. The trade-off with 8 gigabytes is heavy multitasking. If you open Chrome with 30 tabs, plus Discord, plus Spotify, plus a game, you'll start to feel slowdowns. For most students, office workers, and casual gamers, 8 gigabytes is perfectly fine. But for content creators or hardcore multitaskers, it's the bare minimum. 16 gigabytes RAM. 16 gigabytes is the current sweet spot for most enthusiasts, gamers, and creators. It hits the right balance between price and performance. With 16 gigabytes, you can run Windows 11 with dozens of Chrome tabs, multiple apps in the background, Discord, Spotify, and a modern game all at the same time without major slowdowns. You can edit 1080p video, work in Photoshop with large files, run virtual machines for testing, and stream gameplay to Twitch or YouTube. This is the amount most game developers now recommend for modern 8A titles. Some heavy games like Cyberpunk 2077, Hogwarts Legacy, and Star Wars Jedi Survivor actually use close to 16 gigabytes on high settings. 16 gigabytes is the default amount in most mid-range and high-end laptops, pre-built gaming PCs, and Apple's base MacBook Pro. It's also the standard in the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, which gives you a sense of why game developers target this number. The trade-off is that very heavy creative work, like 4K video editing or 3D rendering, will start to push 16 gigabytes to its limits. For everyone else, 16 gigabytes is more than enough. It's the size most people, including myself, would recommend in 2026. 32 gigabytes RAM. 32 gigabytes is for power users, professional creators, and serious enthusiasts. This is the amount you get when you want a PC that handles anything you throw at it without thinking about RAM ever again. With 32 gigabytes, you can run 4K video editing in DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro. Work with massive Photoshop files with hundreds of layers, run multiple virtual machines, compile large code bases, stream gameplay while playing demanding titles, and keep 50 browser tabs open at the same time. 3D artists using Blender or Maya benefit a lot from 32 gigabytes because complex scenes can easily eat 20 gigabytes or more. Modders who play heavily modded games like Skyrim, Cyberpunk 2077, or Microsoft Flight Simulator also benefit, since mods often push memory use much higher than the base game. 32 gigabytes is common in high-end gaming PCs, professional workstations, and content creator laptops. The trade-off is price. 32 gigabytes usually costs significantly more than 16 gigabytes, and most regular users will never see the benefit. If you're a casual gamer or office worker, 32 gigabytes is overkill. But if you do creative work, run virtual machines, or just want future-proofing for the next 5 to 7 years, 32 gigabytes is a smart choice. 64 gigabytes RAM. 64 gigabytes is firmly in professional and workstation territory. This is no longer about everyday computing. It's about specific demanding tasks where RAM directly affects how fast or even whether you can finish your work. With 64 gigabytes, you can edit 8K video, render complex 3D scenes in Blender or Cinema 4D, run several virtual machines at once, work with massive databases, do scientific simulations, train smaller machine learning models, or run heavy CAD software like Autodesk or SolidWorks on huge projects. Game developers, VFX artists, and software engineers working on large projects often need this much. 64 gigabytes is also useful for people running local AI models on their PCs. Some large language models and image generation models need 30 to 50 gigabytes of RAM just to load. The trade-off is obvious. 64 gigabytes is expensive, and for 95% of users, it's completely unnecessary. Even most gamers and content creators don't need this much. You'll only see real benefit if your specific software is consistently using more than 32 gigabytes. Otherwise, your extra RAM just sits there doing nothing. 64 gigabytes is the right choice for professionals with specific high memory workflows, not for general use. 128 gigabytes RAM. 128 gigabytes is workstation and server territory. At this point, you're not building a PC for fun or even regular work. You're building a machine for a specific professional task that genuinely needs this much memory. 128 gigabytes is used by high-end 3D rendering studios, visual effects companies working on movies, large-scale software development environments, scientific research workstations, and people running multiple large virtual machines at the same time. It's also increasingly used by developers and researchers working with local AI models, since the biggest open-source language models can need 70 gigabytes or more just to run. Server administrators use 128 gigabytes for databases, web hosting, and virtualization platforms. The trade-off is enormous. 128 gigabytes of high-quality RAM costs several $1,000s and requires a specific motherboard and CPU that supports it. Consumer Intel and AMD platforms can technically reach 128 gigabytes now, but the motherboards and processors must support it. For any normal user, 128 gigabytes is completely unnecessary and wasteful. You will literally never use even half of it. 128 gigabytes makes sense only when your work software demands it. Otherwise, you're just spending money on RAM that sits empty all day. 256 gigabytes RAM. 256 gigabytes is pure server and enterprise territory. This amount of memory is almost never found in a regular desktop PC. It belongs in data centers, cloud servers, professional render farms, scientific computing clusters, and AI training rigs. With 256 gigabytes, you can run dozens of virtual machines at once, host large enterprise databases, do massive scientific simulations, train medium-sized AI models locally, and handle extremely heavy 3D rendering workloads. Companies like Pixar, Industrial Light and Magic, and large game studios use machines with this much RAM or even more for production work. AI researchers running large language models locally also benefit, since some models need 150 gigabytes or more just to load. The trade-off is everything. 256 gigabytes of server-grade RAM can cost the price of a small car. You need an expensive workstation or server motherboard, often with an AMD Threadripper Pro or Intel Xeon CPU. Cooling and power requirements go up too. For a normal person in 2026, 256 gigabytes is meaningless. You will never use it. It exists for specific professional and enterprise needs only. If you're asking yourself whether you need 256 gigabytes, the answer is almost certainly no. So that's every common RAM size explained, from 128 megabytes all the way up to 256 gigabytes. For most people in 2026, 16 gigabytes is the sweet spot. 8 gigabytes is the bare minimum, and 32 gigabytes is great for creators. Anything above that is for very specific professional work. Anyway, I also made some other cool videos explaining CPUs, GPUs, and SSDs. Don't forget to watch them later. Okay,